So I watched Bo Burnham's new comedy special, and it broke me. Aside from being hilarious and poignant, it made me simultaneously depressed and the most inspired to create than I have been for a long time. Not because he's funnier than I have any right to even attempt to be, or because of the introspection of a man reaching his 30s and the anxieties that surround it. Even though all of that resonated with me on a deeply personal level, what really shook me to my core was that offhand comment he made comparing his dick to the baby in Eraserhead. And even though I knew full well what he meant by that, which made me feel both clever and learned, I realized a good amount of people wouldn't understand that reference. And so that responsibility falls upon me to introduce y'all to David Lynch's seminal feature, Eraserhead. And even with that semi-joking, bizarre premise, I did realize that Bo Burnham's Inside and Lynch's Eraserhead are more similar than I thought. That's serendipity, I guess. In all seriousness, go watch Inside on Netflix. Not sponsored, obviously, but it's genuinely fantastic, and it completely encapsulates what we've all probably felt about 2020, and so much more. It also inspired me to create more. And for once, I kinda wanted to talk about something that I liked. So, Eraserhead. Where do I even start? Honestly, the last thing I want to do is do a play-by-play of the movie and special and extrapolate what every little minutia means. Believe me, you don't want it.
I'm bored.
I first discovered David Lynch relatively later than I'd cared to admit. I knew of him peripherally, the poster for Eraserhead is pretty iconic, and there's even that word, Lynchian, used to describe things that are characteristically reminiscent of the director, offbeat horror, sounds, etc. But it wasn't until January 2018 where I finally buckled down and watched Twin Peaks. That entire experience is a story for another day, but long story short, I was hooked. I quickly bought the Criterion release of Eraserhead from Not all of my comparisons are going to be that lazy, I promise. In any case, I started my journey through his filmography in release order, and he's since become my favorite filmmaker, and his films mean the world to me. Oh, right. I'm sure we'll get to that. But for now, let's dive into one of the central themes Inside and Eraserhead share is anxiety. Burnham spends the majority of the special confined in a single room, no doubt reflective of the 2020 quarantine, but also dealing with his own fears and anxieties, which is a familiar motif to anyone familiar with Burnham's work. Eraserhead permeates anxiety in a lot of the same ways. The majority of the film also takes place in a single room, with the character of Henry dealing with his own anxieties. Anxieties of life, anxieties of marriage, anxieties of fatherhood. And a lot of these mirror director David Lynch's journey, from his early life to the production of Eraserhead. David was born in Missoula, Montana in 1946 to Donald and Sonny Lynch, an agriculturalist for the USDA and English tutor respectively. The eldest of 3 children, his mother took notice of David's creativity early on, nurturing his art by only allowing him to color using blank paper, as opposed to the coloring books given to his younger siblings. Due to Donald's government job, the Lynches rarely stayed in one place for too long, moving from the plains of Idaho to the mysterious Pacific Northwest. David took a serious interest in painting as a teenager, and rented a room in an art studio in Virginia with friend and future collaborator Jack Fisk, and their love for the craft landed them advanced placement at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. David would often lose himself in his art, having painted a particular piece that truly called to him, green foliage in a black void. When taking in his creation, he said to have heard wind coming from the painting, and pictured the greenery moving to it. And that's when it struck him, a desire to create moving paintings. That's actually a really apt description of David Lynch's filmography. Even at the start of the film, that idea is on full display. We're given time to take everything in, much like one would when admiring a canvas. A distorted planet residing within Henry's mind, the sperm-like creature imposed into his head, being flushed away by the man in the planet, played by Jack Fisk, doing so by pulling a series of levers.
Pull the string! Pull the string!
Jokes aside, this very well may be a reference to Ed Wood's infamous Glen or Glenda, as Lynch is said to be a fan of the film. That might explain his adoration for split roles. Come to think of it, you could describe the cinematography of Inside as a moving painting. Shots linger to create a similar Lynchian tone, albeit with a more social media-centric twist. It is interesting how Burnham shifts tones using aspect ratios, with the real world creeping in, juxtaposing it with the biting satire. Returning to Eraserhead, something I noticed in my most recent rewatch is that there's not a single line of dialogue for about 11 minutes. Yet, just through Jack Nance's performance and David Lynch's careful direction, we're told everything we need to know about Henry's character. He's nervous, timid, unsure of himself and his surroundings, yet miserably complacent about where he is in his life. He's dissatisfied, and still trying to maneuver his way through his existence, and the industrial landscape he finds himself living in, much like Lynch was around that time. These images no doubt evoke the feeling of late 60s, early 70s Philadelphia, where David lived during his tenure at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He, alongside fellow student, then wife Peggy, and newborn Jennifer, lived in a rundown house he purchased for only $3,500 due to the area's exceptionally high crime and poverty rate. Lynch would describe it as a poor man's New York City, and a decaying, violent, fearful place, encountering deranged and racist persons, and was often disparaged for his kindness. And even though he found the situation less than pleasant, he claimed that it all sparked his creativity. When money specifically allocated to his art continued to diminish due to familial circumstances, he applied for a grant from the American Film Institute, only to be turned down. David nearly abandoned his dreams, and, much like Henry, started to become complacent, giving into his nightmare of settling. When we finally are privy to dialogue, Henry is told by his neighbor, whom he harbors a certain nervous attraction to, that he received a message while he was out.
A girl named Mary called on the payphone and said she's at her parents' and you're invited to dinner.
Oh yeah?
And when we're introduced to Mary X, portrayed by Charlotte Stewart of Little House on the Prairie fame, they have little in the way of chemistry. But I feel like that's by design. In the previous scene, we're shown a torn photo of Mary from Henry's drawer, indicating that they either ended their relationship or they were on bad terms. But then when we're told about the baby, which oh boy, we'll get to, they agree to get married, which is completely relatable to me. That's why my parents got married. Even after they're hitched, they continue to show little affection for each other and their situation. Mary leaves several times to stay with her parents, leaving all the parenting responsibilities to Henry, to which he is visibly annoyed.
Why don't you just stay home?
Even when she does stay, Henry can't even seem to handle sharing the same bed with Mary. He continuously appears to pine over his neighbor, who he'd much rather be with. Henry is forced to cope with the loss of the freedoms he never even knew he had, due to the monotony of his previous life, brought on even more by his deepening sense of isolation. Initially, tying Bo Burnham to Eraserhead was not intentional, but the deeper I delved into both works, the more similarities I found between them than I originally anticipated. And not just from that offhand joke Burnham made during sexting. Both Eraserhead and Inside perfectly encapsulate the feelings of being trapped in a small room, with no means to escape. In the case of Eraserhead, Henry's room is representative of his life's prison. He's stuck in a repetitive rut that he doesn't want, and he has little to his name, yet he still has to work to keep what little he has. And the only window in his apartment has its views blocked by the bricks of the adjacent building, further adding to his imprisonment. Like Burnham with the pandemic, Henry becomes an inmate of his own mind, and they both begin to lose it. At least Burnham doesn't have to deal with stupid, fucking, ugly, boring children like Henry, and by extension David Lynch had to, with Lynch only being 22 when his first daughter was born, which I believe sparked the central theme of the film, his fear of parenting. Now, with as abstract and bizarre Lynch's works tend to be, I'm fairly confident this is the main motif of the film. Many of the themes and ideas Lynch is associated with make their debuts here as well, such as black and white cinematography, the supernatural, crackling electricity to evoke the otherworldly, other ominous sounds unrelated to electricity, chevroned floors, dancing in another place, dreams, dust in a black void, you get the idea. But the trepidation of parenting is most prevalent here. Take the first scene with Mary's parents, for example. When Henry is asked to cut the genetically altered chickens,
just cut them up like regular chickens? Sure, just cut them up like regular chickens.
Blood spills from between what was once their legs, and Mary's mom begins to moan in pain and anguish, almost orgasmically and like she's possessed, before sprinting out of the room in fear.
You'll be all right in a minute.
I took this to represent childbirth, and the scene's twisted horror as foreshadowing towards the baby. Now, if you've made it this far into the video without seeing Eraserhead, pause it and go watch the movie. Seriously, I don't want your first exposure to it to be a YouTube video. It's on HBO Max, I'm sure your grandma has it if you don't, so just go watch it, okay? Alright, here we go. And there it is, the aforementioned baby from Eraserhead. And it's every bit as grotesque as its reputation. Seriously, it's just so upsetting to look at. It takes a lot for a movie to unnerve me, but this comes pretty damn close. Actually, funny story, while I was watching this with Jeremy and Rebecca, I was admiring the creature on a technical level, not realizing at the same time they were completely disturbed by the damn thing. It's completely understandable, especially when it becomes abruptly sick. What's even more disturbing is those noises are actually the babbling of David's real-life daughter. Yeah, I'm sticking with dogs. Oh, Maya, you're too cute to be the baby from Eraserhead. In fact, nothing you do or say would make you less cute.
Caligula dressed up like a werewolf, raping and killing children. And I bring this up because this is what all elites end up doing. Raping and killing children dressed up like a werewolf.
Oh, you are sick. Now, I've heard differing theories about how the baby was constructed, as Lynch has never stated how the effect was pulled off. At least not publicly. Was it a skinned rabbit? A dead cow calf? A lamb fetus on a pulley system? Guys, it's a puppet. Well, don't get me wrong, it's a damn good puppet, but I highly doubt the American Film Institute would allow David and the crew to have a rotting animal carcass, two-headed boy with pulleys and weights on their property for close to 4 years. Not to mention the smell. Then again, they barely interfered with the production, so what the fuck do I know? Who cares? Fuck you. But this begs the question of why the baby looks like a demon spawn. Is it just supposed to represent the fear of caring for a child?
It's much more than that.
While nobody knows for certain, for people familiar with the life of Lynch, I feel it's pretty obvious. Henry was thrust into fatherhood as quickly as David himself was, just when he felt he had relative security in his schooling, and evaluating how best to express the epiphany of his moving paintings. David's wife Peggy became pregnant. In response, David needed to find sufficient work to provide for his abrupt new family, taking a job as a printer, which, coincidentally, is Henry's profession in the film.
I'm a printer.
And Henry's very clever at printing.
In April 1968, their daughter Jennifer was born, though with what David described as severely clubbed feet, which required extensive surgery for the deformity. The stress of his newborn's well-being, as well as the rejection of the aforementioned AFI grant, left David's art life in limbo. Shortly after, the American Film Institute, impressed by his unique, offbeat style, not only awarded David their grants during their second wave, but invited him to attend their conservatory in Los Angeles, to which David agreed. Although initially dissatisfied with the program, he built a positive rapport with the faculty. They offered David the funds to create a film of his own, as well as the use of the AFI campus and their recently acquired Greystone Mansion for filming. They happily greenlit the project, believing it to be a short, due to the script being only about 21 pages. This started the now infamous 4-year shoot of what would become Eraserhead. Both the film and the special deal with uncomfortable subject matter in very transformative and nuanced ways. Depression, isolation, anxieties of settling down and surrendering your freedoms. Surrendering being the key word here, as suicide seems to be a recurring motif. In the special, Burnham, after singing that he'll off himself at 40, watches himself deliver a disingenuous speech disparaging suicide, not unlike dishonest self-help channels he's lampooned before. His lack of emotion and the uncomfortable, unbroken shot present something all too real for anyone who's been on this dark path. Several of the dark feelings described by Burnham reflect in Henry as well, as he finds solace in spacing out, staring into the radiator, and imagining another world that exists within it. That's when we're introduced to the lady in the radiator, dancing cheerily on her small stage, squashing the sperm-like creatures beneath her heels, no doubt representative of Henry's feelings toward the demon he fathered. She's then given an eerie musical number, which I believe correlates with his suicidal thoughts. In his seclusion, and stripped from what little independence he had, he turns to the lady in the radiator as some sort of twisted beacon of hope, only finding comfort in his own demise. He can't even dwell within his fantasies fully, as his responsibilities creep in. The child taking over his dreams, as represented by it busting his head clean off. Not only is the child poisoning his only escape, but it's also reminding him that he's yet another cog in the machine of his seemingly worthless existence, which I'll touch on in a bit. But we've all been there in some capacity, haven't we? I know I have. Staring at the ceiling, being in another place, imagining a world without me in it. A lot of what resonates with me is, even with how abstract or absurd both Eraserhead or Inside can be, I understand the feelings they're conveying. The depression, the anxieties. I never feel like I'm good enough for much of anything, let alone making YouTube videos. And seeing everything that Lynch and Burnham did before they were my age? I'm not gonna lie, it's discouraging, but I keep at it and creating, because as disheartening as it all can be, in a weird way, it's one of the only things that makes me happy. Hold on, last time I checked, this video was labeled under comedy, so maybe I should lay off the dark shit. Segway. Jeff Bridges' circa 1976 King Kong looking ass.
That's my fetish.
Now I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on my next point, but just hear me out, okay? Eraserhead, despite being a disturbing, unnerving, uncomfortable, body horror inspired film, I think is intended to be a comedy. A dark comedy, but a comedy nonetheless. Let me explain. When we're first introduced to Henry, he's portrayed almost like a bizarro Charlie Chaplin, bumbling about his industrial black and white world, blundering over mounds of dirt, and clumsily stepping into puddles. The movie is so purposefully awkward, it's hilarious. Like the anticipation of the elevator doors taking exactly too long to close. And we cannot forget Mary X's father, lingering on his excruciatingly unsettling smirk. This is simultaneously the funniest shit I've ever seen, and the stuff of nightmares. I love it. Circling back to one of my previous points, when Henry's head is lobbed off during his nightmare sequence, his severed cranium is picked up by some kid and delivered to the Strange Factory, which is where we get probably the most intentional use of comedy in the film.
Okay, Paul!
They take it to the production line and take a drill to the head, which somehow produces pencil erasers? Hence where we get our title, Eraserhead. I watched Red Letter Media's review of the film a while back, and Jay and Josh, whom I usually agree with, said that they don't think that this scene ties into the film at all. But I don't think that's the case. I think this ties into the whole cog in the machine case I made earlier, and Henry not being in control of his own life. I could be completely off base here, and if y'all have a different interpretation of this scene, or anything else from the movie or Bo Burnham's Inside, leave them in the comments below. I'd love to start a discussion. But if you need any more proof that this film is a comedy, look, it's Ted's dad from the Bill and Ted movies.
It's okay.
Whoa.
Also, do I even have to talk about Bo Burnham's special at this point? Come on, he's healing the world with comedy, making a literal difference, metaphorically.
Get up. I'm talking to you. Get the fuck up!
While the conclusions to both are radically different, the central focus of what they're trying to achieve individually is the same. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. See, the Netflix special ends with Bo Burnham finally getting to leave, after an unhinged performance of All Eyes on Me. But it's revealed that he hasn't left, and we watch Burnham watch himself trying to get back inside. Aside from the obvious parallel to 2020, I took this to mean, even though he wants to re-enter the world, he still finds it more comfortable to be stuck in his room. Away from the world, and the burdens of his anxiety, even though the isolation is just as anxiety-inducing.
I know how that feels.
But what I find interesting is that Bo starts to laugh before he quickly cuts to credits. He succeeded in his goal. He laughed. It's simple, and yet powerful. It's maddening how talented this man is. Eraserhead's ending is a bit harder to explain. The baby does nothing but cry, and becomes sicker and sicker as the events of the movie draw to a close. Finally, Henry can't take it anymore, unwrapping the baby's bandages, only to find they were the only thing keeping it together. He decides to put the poor thing out of its misery, and what follows is nothing short of nightmare-inducing. The baby wails inhumanly and distorts to an even more monstrous form, fatally turning the tables on poor Henry. Even his demise is out of his control, as represented again by the man in the planet. But after everything, he finds himself in the arms of the lady in the radiator, the light overwhelming the screen, and Henry, finally at peace. That's what I think makes these endings similar. A sense of success. Henry and Burnham are finally able to escape, though perhaps not on their own terms. They're both left vague and open to interpretation. But what I adore about both projects is, even though we can have our own ideas of what it all means, you can tell that it means something to them. That's what separates Lynch and Burnham from the Christopher Nolans and Zack Snyders of the world. Nuances, and trusting their audiences to draw their own conclusions, even if it is personal or spiritual.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
We'll elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
Conclusion. Both Eraserhead and Inside took an unusual amount of time to complete. Inside by design, but Eraserhead due to necessity. As I mentioned before, production for Eraserhead lasted 4 years and was beset by financial issues. But unlike other productions that went over schedule and over budget, the story behind Eraserhead is actually somewhat uplifting. When the initial AFI funding was spent, Lynch and the crew took various odd jobs to keep the project afloat, with Lynch even getting a paper route with Jack Nance. Even Carrie star Sissy Spacek donated money to the project, as her husband was the man in the planet himself, Jack Fisk. Even when the backing reached its lowest, the crew continued to work, just because they believed in David so much.
We'll just give you our time. We'll pitch in.
When it was finally finished, they all met at David's favorite restaurant, Bob's Big Boy, which, by the way, while editing, he was told to keep his big boy trips to a minimum.
I'll go, 24 hours. But if you will not take your Bob's break in the afternoon, which almost killed me.
It was always important to David that everyone be paid, so they wrote out on a napkin how much of a cut everyone would get from Eraserhead's revenue. The whole process reads less like a Heaven's Gate nightmare and more like a let's put on a show scenario, which I love. The film was finally released in 1977, to very little fanfare, only playing to an audience of about 25 people. However, it quickly amassed a cult following, and was shown as a midnight movie during the late 70s, akin to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Critical reception warmed significantly over time, with Stanley Kubrick calling it his favorite film, and impressing producer Mel Brooks so much he put David in the director's chair of The Elephant Man. Eraserhead is now preserved at the National Film Registry, and launched the careers of not only David Lynch, but Jack Nance and Catherine Coulson, who went on to star in arguably Lynch's most well-known work, Twin Peaks, based on an idea he came up with on the set of Eraserhead. The cult success also gave us the greatest thank you that only David Lynch could deliver, that involves no less than 5 Woody Woodpecker plushies.
This is Chucko, and this is Buster, and this is Pete. I'm David Lynch, and this is Bob, and this is Dan. And we just wanted to get together and thank all of the people that have supported Eraserhead through the years.
Eraserhead is, if nothing else, one of the most unique films ever made, and certainly one of my favorites. I see it as kind of a thesis statement for Lynch's entire career, and I think it's a great gateway into the abstract, because in a strange way, it's probably his most straightforward film. Perhaps aside from the aptly named Straight Story. Nevertheless, it cannot be overstated that this is all just my opinion from my experience with the film, and it is extremely important to me, and especially David Lynch, that no definitive interpretation is held above any others. If you had a different takeaway from the film than I had, great! Your experience is just as valid, and maybe we could start a dialogue in the comments. Because as we all know, opinions in the comments are always civil.
Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seats. All eyes on me, all eyes on me. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seats. All eyes on me, all eyes on me. Yeah. Are you feeling nervous? Are you having fun? It's almost over. It's just begun. Don't overthink this. Look in my eye. Don't be scared. Don't be shy. Come on in. The water's fine. We're going to go where everybody knows. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. We're going to go where everybody knows. Everybody knows. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat. All eyes on me. All eyes on me. Yeah. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat. All eyes on me. All eyes on me. Yeah. Hands down. Pray for me. Hands down now. Pray for me. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat. All eyes on me. All eyes on me.
I'd like to thank Pinecone, Ellie, Alina, Shara, Catherine, and Samuel for supporting me on Patreon. And thank you for making it to the end of the video. I know it took forever for this one to come out, but... oh no!
Get your fucking hands up.
Get up. Get up. I'm talking to you. Get the fuck up.
Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat. All eyes on me. All eyes on me. Yeah. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat. All eyes on me. All eyes on me. Yeah. Come on, hands down. Pray for me. Hands down now. Pray for me. Get your fucking hands up. Get on out of your seat.